Hello, everybody. It's Mr. Jackson's Peanut Butter Hour. We're going to be talking about symbolism today. I hope everybody's ready. I hope everybody's excited. I actually don't know how we're going to do this. I'm floating around in a big black void. I'm not really sure how to talk about symbolism, but hello. Glad everybody is here. What's happening? There's a bunch of... Oh, there's like a fight happening on Discord. Not a fight with any of our people, so that's good. We're going to be talking about symbolism in creative writing and how symbolism works, or how we can better understand the writing of symbolism. So that's what we're really focused on today. But also, we're just kind of chilling. First of all, it's Peanut Butter Hour. I have this peanut butter, but I don't have a spoon, and I'm all out of my Reese's peanut butter eggs. So I should have definitely grabbed those before I started this whole thing. You guys should also grab your peanut butter, and while I grab mine, I'll give you time to grab yours. Grab your peanut butter, ready, go! Did you?
What?
You opened them.
Yeah, and I want one.
I had a box of 6 stinking eggs. Now I have 2 of them. I won't talk about where they went, but they didn't go into my belly, that's for sure. All right. Hey, everybody. Who would you rather kill, a bee or a human? I would much rather kill a bee. Don't ask me why that's the case. I don't prefer killing anything, but, you know, if it comes down to it, I would definitely rather kill a bee. I think that's just evolution for you. We got to protect our own species. But I haven't read the whole conversation that you had on Discord, Katie, so I'll have to get caught up. Grab your peanut butter, everybody. It's Mr. Jackson's Peanut Butter Hour. Hey, Molly. Peanut butter time. So, when we talk about symbolism in creative writing, how we figure out how symbolism works, a lot of people think that writers sit down and they're like, how do I come up with a really good idea that's very symbolic and deep and has a lot of stuff going on? But for the most part, writers don't behave that way. Writers aren't sitting there planning out every single step of the process. The art of writing is oftentimes in the edit, not in the initial writing. And in the initial writing, you're going to find symbolism that comes out. You're going to find things that you consistently go back to, right? We're going to actually look at Frozen. How many of you guys have seen the movie Frozen? Give a thumbs up in the chat. Boom. I'm glad you put a surgical mask on your Minecraft character. So if you think of the movie Frozen, and the symbolism in Frozen, you can look at the song Love is an Open Door, and you can look at the idea of opening up the gates and how this concept of being closed off versus being open affects the symbolism within the whole story, right? So you have to imagine that somebody sat down and was like, I'm going to write a story about an ice princess and her sister in isolation, and I'm going to have doors be a huge symbol in it. And now I'm going to spend all this time writing about the symbolism of doors, right? Not the case. For the most part, that process happens by simply starting the story. And let's start with a simple plot and then move from a simple plot into something more complicated by including symbolism. So if I think of what naturally creates good symbolism, it's going to be the ideas that are around me already, right? So if I'm telling the story about Mr. Jackson's Peanut Butter Hour, I have my peanut butter. That's a symbol. I really hope you all have peanut butter. It makes these moments so much better. All right. That's water. So, when you think of that symbolism of love being open door, you got to look at what looking at me like, who's this man? That's how my cat looks at me too. You got to look at what's around you while you're writing a situation. And when you're writing your plot, try and write it with as much sensory language as possible, because sensory language gives you more points in which you can connect to symbolism. All right. So think about the story of Animal Farm. Animal Farm is famously about something else. It's an allegory, right? But in telling the story, he doesn't start off by being like, pigs are like communists. He simply writes the story of communism and communist Russia and the USSR into a story about a farm, right? So not every aspect of that is symbolic. And it's a matter of saying, how do I then take a story, a plot, and make things more symbolic for other stuff, right? So in the story of Animal Farm, there's a lot of references. I have seen the movie Hidden Figures, love Hidden Figures. There's a lot of references in Animal Farm to the windmill. And we have to wonder, what does the windmill represent? But in reality, we can just read the story and the windmill represents nothing more than a windmill. That's good symbolism. So when you get frustrated at your English teachers, because they're forcing you to look for symbolism that you're like, I'm not even sure the symbolism is there, recognize that you don't have to enjoy every aspect of symbolism in order to enjoy the book. Many of you likely watched all of Frozen without necessarily recognizing the symbolism that was there. You watched it, you enjoyed it, you thought it was a good plot, the plot moved it forward, but the idea of closing oneself off, love is an open door, and the idea of being open, not necessarily being the right solution to things, and holding people close to you and making sure that you're not being too open with them, all develops because that is the initial plot that's developing, right? As that plot develops, we find symbolism in the things that come up, right? So I have a story. In this case, I'm going to start with the story of Mr. Jackson. Mr. Jackson is sitting and he is creating a YouTube channel. He is doing a live stream on YouTube. And every time that he sits down, there is a monitor right in front of him. There is a camera looking back at him. And then there's a bright light that's shining in his face, right? All I'm doing is describing the situation that I'm in. I'm looking at the stuff that's around me and I'm describing it in detail. Now, if I talk about how this story changes, right, over time, I need some sort of conflict, something that pushes against me that makes it difficult. So in this case, the conflict that's going to exist is that the power goes out, right? Now the power goes out and I can't do my live streams. I can't access any of this technology and the lights don't turn on. Notice how when I described my situation, there was a light that was staring back at me. I was under bright lights. And then as the lights get turned off, the power goes away. Now lights end up acting as a symbol for other stuff that we see within the narrative. As I go back to writing about the lights, it's just simply an easy way for me to convey the sensory feeling of the electricity being gone. But as the story develops, I keep on going back to the lights as a symbol. So I would say, Mr. Jackson sitting here, staring in front of his monitor, the lights shining on his face, casting a shadow of all the things that he's reading on his screen, and there's a big bright light that makes sure that everyone can see where he is and what he's doing, right? Then, all of a sudden, the lights go out. All of the power is turned off. Mr. Jackson has to go outside, and in going outside, he sees the sun for the first time in many, many hours, and he hisses, because that's what I do every time I go outside, because too bright. And so now this big bright sun is illuminating not just me, but everyone around me. I see my neighbors. I see all the people walking their pets. When I go back inside, the lights are all off, but there is now light coming in through the windows, right? So now I have a symbol of light just because of the way in which I've described the situation that we're in, right? That is a natural symbol that comes about from telling the story, right? And I go back to that narrative and I can find my symbols within my narrative. So it's a matter of creating a sensory level of storytelling, right? If I'm consistently going back and showing something in my story because that thing is important and it is changing or adapting with my narrative, then it becomes a symbol naturally. You can also do this retroactively. Let's say I'm writing my whole story, right? I write my story and I'm really bored. I'm Mr. Jackson sitting down in front of his live stream. I don't mention anything about the lights in my face. Mr. Jackson sitting down in front of his live stream. He walks outside. He sees some animals. He feels inspired to go back inside, and all the lights are still off, but there's light coming in through his window. See how in the third act, I have that symbol that came out. That I wanted this very powerful moment where I was sitting there and light was coming in through my window. And from there, I can retroactively, yeah, you have to be here, Ender. Everyone knows that. How are you late? Oh my gosh, I'm going to mark you tardy. No. In case you're wondering, nobody has to be on these live streams, but this is what's fun for me. So when we talk about symbolism within writing, you can retroactively put it in there when you find something that you latch onto as a strong symbol. So if you're writing a scene and you're like, wow, this scene, I feel like something about the way that there are cobwebs in the corner, or something about the way that the light comes in through the windows, something about the way that there's dust on the shelf, just really resonates with me as an author. Now I can go back, retroactively write that into what my story was, and turn my story into something more by adding symbolism that wasn't previously there, right? The symbol comes from sensory storytelling. Sensory storytelling comes from feeling what you're writing. You don't want to just write something. You want to be there and document what you're seeing from an imaginary standpoint, right? That's why people say, write what you know. It's a lot easier to just sit here in this moment, staring at this screen, and write about the screen. It's a lot easier to do that than it is for me to say, okay, let me travel to a magical world, and in this magical world, there's a wizard. Now I'm having to rely on other concepts that I already have in my head. Something like, my view of a wizard is a guy who has a big long white beard and has a big silly hat. Now I'm not doing a lot of creative work here. I'm not writing from my own actual sensory experiences. I'm borrowing from other sensory experiences and putting them together into a collage of ideas. That's not ultimately going to have the same impact of me being fully present in a place and writing about that place, right? The best ways to capture sci-fi and fantasy is to go to places that seem like they're out of this world and then describe them in brutal detail, right? Living in the desert makes that really easy because we're actually very close to a lot of sets for things like Star Wars and things like Dune. All of those things were filmed out in big, vast deserts, right? This is already sort of an alien planet to some extent. Episodes of Star Trek were filmed out here as well. So when you think about it in that way, step into those places and describe those places. When we then talk about the architecture of that place, the way that the place is structured, right? The curve of the mountains, those things start to become more alien or more fantastic. And in that, we can then draw out more symbols. Maybe in describing the way that the sand forms these crazy hills within the deserts, you also talking about how an alien life form has millions and millions and millions of the species, and they all work together to create something, right? You're drawing from the actual experience that you have in front of you, and you're creating something from that. So that way you can create very rooted fantasy writing, very rooted science fiction writing, very rooted anything, really poetry, music, is by looking at the stuff that's around you and trying your best to capture the sensory feeling of that. Then you can move from there to putting that into symbolism. If you have sensory writing, it's very easy to find symbolism. Famously, from a English teacher standpoint, talking about something like Great Gatsby. Great Gatsby has this image of these eyes that stand over everything and look out onto the world like a god, right? I don't think that when he was originally writing that, F. Scott Fitzgerald was thinking, I'm going to have this be, yeah, I agree with that. He wasn't thinking, I'm going to have this be some sort of grand image that I draw from, and I'm going to keep on going back to this. I bet he saw something inspiring about that actual image while he was in New York, and he was like, I'm going to describe that. And in describing it, captured something that was out of this world. And that made it work really well as a symbol. It had something somewhat special about it. If I look at my desk right now, and I look at just the things that are around my desk, first of all, I see a lot of embarrassing trash that I'm not going to show you guys. Second of all, not much stands out, but for some reason, I have a bright yellow controller, right? In the same way, as I'm writing, as I'm talking about this sort of stuff, I would go through and see all of the blacks and all of the grays and all of the blacks and all of the grays, and then I would ultimately land on this object. And this object seems exceptional to me. What makes it exceptional is that it's not like everything else that's around me. So it makes for a really good symbol, right? I can draw from that exceptional thing and turn it into a great point of symbolism, right? Looking at something like Animal Farm does a great job of, I just noticed something over there, sorry. Animal Farm does a great job of turning the symbol of the windmill into this idea of nuclear power and what they're focused on in the Russian government. But you also have to look at what George Orwell was drawing from when he was writing that. He was looking at the histories of the USSR, and he was looking at what was happening at the time. And from there, their desire for an economy and an energy source that was separate from other people was a big deal. And so that needed to be a highlight of his story. It was something that stood out from the rest of the world, from the rest of what he was writing. He knew that that was a big deal to those people. And from there, that becomes a bigger symbol within his writing. So yeah, basically find an object that modifies how a subject is. Find an object that stands out from the rest of your narrative and allow that to be the thing that you focus on, right? Let's say it's a rainy day, and we're going to be writing about the rainy day. It's very easy for rain to become a go-to metaphor because it's something out of the ordinary. It's not rainy every single day. So today is different because today is a rainy day. But having a rainy day doesn't make really anything special or symbolic other than there's water falling from the sky. When we look at more specific things, in what way does water falling from the sky transform that world, right? Now the light is muted. Now the colors are darker and more rich. So maybe I'm not talking about a rainy day. What instead I'm talking about is how the rainy day made richness within this certain plant. I look at the grass and I see how rich and dark green the grass is. And from there, I say, wow, if this dark green grass is so rich, right? In what other ways do exceptional things change my environment, right? So I'm looking at that specific thing, I'm drawing on it, and that makes my symbolism not something that's just very basic, like, ooh, water falls from the sky, and therefore we're all washed clean, right? I don't know if you guys are familiar with that song by, who did that song? Hilary Duff? Let the rain fall down and wash my dream. Let it wash away my memories. Wanna be... I'm sorry, I got really distracted. So just like that, that's a very easy symbol to go on. Instead, what we're going to do is say, how does... Why do I? I don't want to check my DMs. I hope it's for good things. Okay, cool. Is it about bees? Well, so when it comes to symbolism, what you're looking for is stuff that really significantly matters to what you are describing. And then you want to go from what you're describing into what makes it essential and what makes it different from other things, or how it affects the environment. And then you can retroactively change that, right? So now I'm going to retroactively go back and say, from my story, I'm going to see that a guy is sitting on his back porch and looking at the grass, and the grass is dead. Now I've created an image at the beginning, and I show how that image has shifted by the end, right? I'm modifying the image as I'm writing. So if I see something that really stands out in this specific moment, in the scene that I'm writing, I can allow that thing that stands out to become the bigger thing. So I look at my desk, I see this bright yellow controller, and now I can say, since this thing was exceptional in that moment, in the moment where Mr. Jackson was sitting there doing his stream, I'm going to then rely on that as my image later on. Or I can retroactively, let's say this is the last scene of the movie. I'm sitting here and I'm talking to you guys and I have this bright yellow controller. Now I can retroactively write that into the beginning. So I can say, Mr. Jackson sat at his desk and there was constantly a lot of noise and a lot of stuff going on. But ultimately his desk was surrounded by black and gray. Everything at his desk was black and gray, right? And now I can start writing into that final moment where I say he's looking at his desk and he finally sees the bright yellow controller. And the bright yellow controller allows for that to be a symbol of how things have changed. Now, if I want to go back even further, I can say I want yellow to act as that symbol. So maybe I had something that was like this person walked up and was wearing a green hat. Now I can change green hat to yellow hat and it feels like it's more symbolic, right? I personally think that's a bit of a cop-out. I think that it's a way in which you can challenge yourself to write more symbolism, but ultimately your goal is not to write something and then force symbolism into it. Your goal is to become somebody who writes and who finds symbolism in that writing, right? So you want to get to a point where you can do things almost on accident. You want to get to that point where symbolism isn't a chore. It's not something that you're working towards every single time. It's something more that when you look at the world, you see a world that is filled with symbolism. And from there, you're writing about that world that's filled with symbolism. Reading more poetry, reading more writing allows you to think within that confine, that construct, right? So instead of looking at the grass and being like, that's grass, those are rocks, that's a couch, this is a TV. You're now looking at it and seeing something that's a lot deeper, something that's a bigger inspiration, right? Try to view the world as being filled with some sort of divine purpose. And then from there, you can say every single thing that is here has some greater purpose to it than just what I'm observing or attributing to it. So everything has the option, the ability to become the bigger thing. Everything has that chance to become the big symbolic thing. I look at my desk and now instead of color, I'm looking for anything that's exceptional in a different way. And I see this paper plate that used to have bagel bites. Sorry, I'm reading Sammy's note. And so I see this paper plate that used to have bagel bites, and it is the only thing on the desk that is evidence that I've made progress in life. Everything else sits here and gathers dust, but this is something I consumed, right? And so that's what makes it exceptional, or that's what makes it different. I look around at my desk, I see not colors, I don't see my paper plate, but I see instead my switch, or I see instead my light that I have here. Now I'm just talking about some of the same stuff that I already was talking about. I see for some reason this little dude is hiding out because I'm guessing somebody put it there. I didn't put this here. But looking at something like that, anything on my desk can be exceptional for any number of reasons. Here, this looks pretty unexceptional. That is a simple SD card, right? And it is completely unimportant. Oh, look at my silver fist. That's cool. So that SD card is a little black box on a desk that's completely covered with other stuff that doesn't really matter. That SD card likely doesn't have any information on it, right? It seems completely unnecessary and unimportant. And that's what makes that symbolism strong. Is that it still is exceptional to everything else that's on my desk. I can find meaning within everything else, but this little thing, which is supposed to hold memories, instead holds nothing and is empty and shallow. Now we have a deep symbol, right? You look like that one superhero in Fantastic Four. The Thing. Might I do that? All right. Honestly, if you're outlining and planning your themes, extended metaphors, symbols, etc., should be among the first things that you jot down. Yes. Oh, I look like I look like the Silver Surfer. I like that you picked one superhero that's not even in the Fantastic Four. Yeah. Great. Lovely. Okay. So, in talking about this, Sammy, you are absolutely, I think that is part of the process that you go through when you are creating something. You can write down and plan out how you want your themes and extended metaphors and symbols to work themselves out as you're writing, or you can simply write what you're in the moment. And as your story progresses, you will find things that work as strong symbols, and you can allow those things to affect your narrative as you go back and edit it, right? Ultimately, your first go through, if you sit down and you're like, I'm just going to write and I'm going to include all of these symbols that I really want to include, you're going to realize at the end of it that either the symbols didn't work as well as you wanted them to, or that wasn't the symbol that you really wanted and you could resonate with something else, and you're going to edit it. And in the editing process, you're going to find something that stands out even more. The most dangerous thing that you can do is be so attached to your writing as if this is like a very special, important thing that you've brought into the world, that you're unwilling to do the difficult process of editing it, right? I don't want anybody to be so attached to their writing that they're afraid to lose that one word because they're like, that word is the entire symbolism of everything. That's where the meaning of the writing is. Ultimately, the meaning of your writing should be able to be found over and over and over again, right? It is something where you are finding meaning within the universe as a whole. And from that meaning, you're extracting something greater and putting that into words, right? So, like I said with my desk, I started off with just a light in my face being the main symbol I used. But then I moved to the controller. I moved to the SD card. I moved to the trash, right? And in different ways, I can allow those things to be symbols. I think when we look at something loaded with symbolism, I think of Frankenstein is a great example of something that's simply loaded with symbolism, right? I don't think that Mary Shelley's original intention was, let me write down all of these symbolic things. I think that she was writing from her experience, and I think that she was allowing her experience to be filtered through a symbol, right? That's what created that science fiction element, where it's like, I'm bringing something back to life. So, that ended up creating multiple points in which symbols could be drawn out, but it never gets in the way of her plot. It's never that her plot is there to serve the symbols. It's not like, hey, look, this is what's happening. There's a movie. There's a movie that's really good. Mother. If you've ever seen Mother, that's a great example of symbolism getting in the way of plot. Mother is all symbolism, and it's very powerful. Don't get me wrong, that's a great way to write things, and you can create stuff in that way. It's just not the way that's going to create something that you can easily access, or that if you're starting off, you're going to feel confident in. So you look at something like Mother, the movie, not the game, and with that, you've got everything about it, every single shot, everything that's happening is focused on that symbolism. And that at every single step gets in the way of telling any sort of cohesive story, which is what led many people to be like, I don't know what's going on in that movie. I don't know why I'm watching it. And a lot of people who are film critics were like, well, didn't you notice all of this symbolism? Didn't you notice all the stuff that was going on underneath? And the main audience was like, no. I didn't, nor did I care. So ultimately, you're trying to point out a world that has a lot of symbolism to people who aren't seeing that. You're giving voice to a world that is filled with meaning to those who are refusing to see meaning in the world. If you are just preaching to the choir in that way, I think that you're losing out on a opportunity to connect with people who desperately need to see the world as something deeper. I don't think that you lose out on quality of writing just because you are focused on an audience and saying, I want that audience to know what I'm saying. I want to communicate something clearly to that audience, which isn't to say that that's the only way to write. So if you're writing something with deep symbolism that's been planned out well in advance, and that you're following that sort of structure, then that's great, as long as that's something that's going to get you to actually begin the process of writing. there's too many times that somebody has come to me in a creative writing class or in a creative writing club, and they've said, look at my book full of notes about the book I want to write. And I understand the note-taking process is a huge part of that, especially if you're world building. However, I always say, give me the first chapter of the book. Who's the main character? Where's our narrative going? Because something has to invite me into that world, right? And as silly as it sounds, that's where Men in Black, the movie, does a really great job. Men in Black, the movie, is literally introducing us to a world of worlds where everything is far more expansive than we could possibly imagine. And that is a huge point to the plot, is that there's this world underneath and over everything else that you're seeing. There's a ton of symbolism in the movie. But at no point does any of that symbolism get in the way of Will Smith shooting guns and being like, I'm handsome and cool, right? You're still introduced to this world through a character that is charming and compelling, and that allows us to see the world in a deeper way and allows us to understand the meaning a little bit better. So the more that we do that, the more that we give people an access point where they can see through that lens, the more that we're writing in sensory language, the better that writing is going to be. So we can plan it all out. That's great, but I would say that that ultimately comes second to writing it down. So when you're planning things out, make sure that your planning things out is not getting in the way of you creating a plot that's pushing you forward, right? Because ultimately, your symbols will change and what you think is important will change if you've begun writing and you've given character and plot life. Because those characters and those plots will ultimately start to create a narrative that's beyond what your planning is. You will have these intuitive thoughts about how to write. You'll have these intuitive thoughts about how the narrative should go. And trusting those intuitions is what allows those characters and that plot to live beyond your own plan, right? You don't want everything to feel like it was all like deeply thought out and scripted from the beginning. A great example of this is Knives Out, the movie. All right? Knives Out, the movie. You've got Rian Johnson, who is, in my opinion, one of the greatest filmmakers alive right now. And he is amazing at symbolism and at plot twists and at making things seem like very meticulously thought out. I've seen multiple interviews with Rian Johnson. I'll try and put some of those links in where he talks about basically writing for plot first, right? So you've got these characters that you're filling this world with, and nothing says that more than looking at his earlier work. His earlier work, like the movie Brick, if you've never seen Brick, I strongly suggest you go and watch that, although it can be pretty triggering. There is a death involved. And drug use. But Brick does a really great job of giving us characters that we really, really want to know. He also then creates an entire world that feels like our world, but slightly different. Everything from the dialogue, the way that it's written, the syntax in which way people talk, all of that is foreign. All of that is planned out, right? And yet, everything feels very fluid and natural because we're given Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character right from the very beginning as a main focus, and he's charming, he is exciting, he's doing the stuff that's bringing us into this plot, and we see the entire world through that lens. Every moment, every shot is a sensory experience of that character. So from there, we're creating a symbolism. We're going from characters and plot into how we find symbolism through that, right? We allow our characters to see the world with its intentions, right? It's not ultimately F. Scott Fitzgerald that's sitting there writing about how the eyes are watching God and they're staring over all of us, right? It is ultimately our main character in Great Gatsby that is seeing those things, and we're seeing it through that lens, and that's allowing us to understand the world more deeply, all right? So I'm going to just take questions from you guys because I feel like I spieled way too spiely for that, and I didn't even have anything for you guys to look at. So like, here's a big black background. I just talked for 30 minutes about symbolism. What are any of you guys' questions about this, about school, about peanut butter? How are you guys feeling? I hope you guys are all doing well. I know that yesterday was a pretty big announcement that school is done for the rest of the year. And so that could be tough for a lot of people, especially if you're feeling a little bit trapped or if you're feeling like you're a senior. So, about one-lines. How am I? I'm doing pretty good. My dog went to the hospital today. I did a TikTok, but I'm getting very much cooped up and feeling like a sense of we're never going to do the daily pick in my classroom again. What I'm going to do, I'm going to go take a picture of my classroom and then put that up as my background so that we can make that happen. I'm glad you like the TikTok. Okay, so first lines. So when we talk about like how to start writing something, I would say don't get too hung up on your first line. Your first line should be, if you're writing a narrative that's not right where you're at, it should be the first thing you see when you close your eyes, right? So let's say I want to write a story about a dog living in the mountains with his best friend who's a chicken, right? A dog and a chicken living in the mountains all by themselves. I close my eyes and I see through the eyes of the dog as the dog is staring out on a mountainside. And I would write something along the lines like, the fog rolled into the mountains and covered the tops of the hills as I stared out, wondering where I belong in this world, period. And then I just start writing. Okay, I'll pose for my daily picture. This is like my favorite thing. Is this bad that I like this? The shy thing? Okay. Bah! Okay, I did my best. Good. So hopefully that answers the question. If you are writing a story, you start with the first thing that you see and you try to bring other people into the story. Try and give sensory details. Sad face shyness. So try to give sensory details, and the more that you give sensory details, the more that you invite somebody else in to feel that experience. So you want to definitely start off with something you can see, feel, touch, hear. Those sort of things get people to immediately dive into that spot. If you start with something philosophical, and I did this a lot when I was in college when I was writing, I would start with like a dreamlike state because that's how I felt whenever I started writing. You can do that stylistically. It's totally fine. If you're asking for my advice, I would say ground it in something. Give me something that I can sink my teeth into literally, right? And no, I would say that it doesn't change as I'm writing a song. Hoop-a-doop. Are we going to do this? I think my son might have detuned this. Yeah, a lot. All right, so if I'm writing a song and I want my first line to be something, I think of that song that I showed you guys many times, but it starts off with, I drove up the California coast on a road curved like a snake, right? I'm immediately giving an image that people can sink their teeth into, right? I'm staring out in the mountains, watching the fog roll in. I'm wondering why I am here, I'm wondering where I've been. And days go by like anything else. I think this might be my personal hell. All right. detail heavy opening line gives me that same sort of turn off feeling as starting with a super heavy piece of philosophy, right? So I think I'm not saying a super heavy line. I'm saying just describing immediately what is seen or felt, right? I don't want it to feel like, I want to describe my normal, right? I wanted to describe exactly where that character is in that first moment. I don't know how else I would set a scene or establish a character other than by doing that with some sort of sensory detail. So I wouldn't just say like, Alex sits at his desk. That doesn't really introduce me to the situation well. I don't feel that Alex is sitting at his desk. I don't see that Alex is sitting at his desk. I don't know who Alex is, right? I'm ultimately wanting to interact with that narrative in a way that makes me feel like I'm present in that moment. And I can start that by just giving something sensory that helps me to feel what it's like to be there, right? It was cold. Good opening line. At least then I feel like I'm cold, right? It was, I would also try to avoid, and these are general suggestions, they're by no means rules. Rules, when it comes to writing, are, for the most part, because of postmodernism, things that we focus on breaking and bending. So I would not refer to these as rules so much as guidelines to help people get started with writing, and to sink their teeth into something themselves, right? Because it's easy to look at a scene and just want to describe the plot of the scene and say, okay, here's the plot of the scene. This thing happens, then this thing happens, then this thing happens, the end. And I need to feel like I'm present in the scene. I need to feel like the characters are real in the scene. So I don't want to just give it this sort of offhanded look at it where it's like, it's stating facts, right? However, if that's the character's perspective on it, then stating facts could be a great way to introduce it, right? If you're doing that with intention, right? You said something about being invited into the plot. It got me thinking about the songs that I like, and what's kind of common is telling of emotion, almost foreshadowing emotions, right? Which I kind of did as well, right? The symbol of like, of looking out into the mountains and wondering about your purpose, right? But I would also say that don't think of anything as the first line until you've finished the first draft. Don't think of anything as like, oh my gosh, I need to write this right now. The best piece of advice I got about that, especially when it came to poetry, was about the idea of thinking of poetry or any writing as being inspired by muses. Muses are something outside of yourself. They seem to go by almost randomly. You are not responsible for how good the muses are. You are not responsible for the content of the muses. Your responsibility is for capturing the muse. And, who was it? The woman who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, whom I love. I think she's a great author, especially she's good at talking about how to write. But she talks about capturing a muse and holding it by its tail and then writing a poem from finish to start rather than from start to finish, right? Because it came out backwards. The same sort of way, I don't want you to think, oh my gosh, I created this thing and therefore I'm responsible for every single bit of it. And if I didn't do good enough, then it's my fault that it's not good enough. You're simply curating the skills that are necessary for capturing what the muses are as they go by. You might have eyes that are able to see muses that I could never see, things about the world that I could never draw from the world. And when you see those things, the way in which you capture those muses may very well be without any sensory language, right? You might say, I don't require any sensory language, and that's not the way that I interact with the world. And your unique voice in that could be very powerful. But for the majority of people, sensory language is a great way in which we interact with the details of the world, right? We interact with our senses, first and foremost. And they tell us something about the world that seems almost animalistic, right? It's not something that is cognitive. It's something that is emotional. It is felt. It is real. It is grounded. think that is it telling of the character part is really what I like to focus on as a reader. I'd rather be eased into the world, setting, metaphor, etc. But in my opinion, having a strong setup for your character is super important. And I think there's something to be said of introducing your character in order to introduce your world. I think that your characters need to be real, but I also think that characters and sensory details go hand in hand, because your character is determined by how they interact with sensory details, right? So maybe a terrible example, but looking at Men in Black shows us the way in which he's seeing every little detail. Him as a character being attuned to detail is what leads him to notice that this guy has cat-like eyelids instead of human eyelids, right? So I'm noticing something sensory and something character-driven, right? When I see that the dog that I've made up that has a best friend who's a chicken is staring out at the mountainside and not staring at the chicken, it tells me something about how that character is, what that character's focus is, and lets me see through their lens. So that's where I would say it's a sensory detail, but it's a sensory detail told through a character's lens, even if you're writing in the third person. So even if you're writing about a dog that, you're saying this dog stands and stares out at the mountainside, right? I think that ultimately when you're writing in that third person, it can make you feel very removed from what is happening and make it more difficult to get to sensory language, which then results in people having trouble feeling rooted in what's happening and you having to rely more heavily on plot to shape your characters, right? I think that plot shaping characters is very Hollywood. It's like the way that most movies work, but not the way that most books work. It's not the way that we usually like to consume books. So when we talk about like, maybe the difference between the movie version and the book version of Perks of Being a Wallflower, right? The book version of Perks of Being a Wallflower, every single sentence is written from his first person perspective and is written like a journal. The way in which the sentences are written shapes the way I view him as a character. He gets better at writing as he learns more from his English teacher. And it's very powerful in the way that that's sort of set up, right? That he's writing from the perspective of this character, but it's also very sensory. Like I feel like I can be in the letter that he is writing as he's writing it, and that I can capture the moments that he's capturing. Whereas with the movie, everything is very third person. And it's difficult to feel like I'm in his shoes. And so when, spoiler alert, he has a mental breakdown towards the end of the film / book, I don't feel it as much. And I think it lost some of its emotional weight. It lost a lot of what made that character charming in the first place. But ultimately, the world that he's experiencing in Perks of Being a Wallflower, he's experiencing entirely through his lens. And that helps me to understand his character better. It's a very sensory lens, though. So I would still say. And I think that like modern, postmodern, etc., with weird sort of narrators and characters often nail the opening line because they're pretty in tune with how their characters perceive things, right? Well, and I think that when it comes to postmodernism, a lot of it is like trying to make sure that your character's unique lens is the highlight of everything that is being said. And so like when I think of postmodernism, as silly as this is, I think of like the fourth wall breaking that we get from Deadpool and Ferris Bueller and that sort of stuff, right? Like ultimately we're treated like we are a character and we're being introduced almost directly to this character, and we're trying to break down the barriers that are separating us from those things. And I don't know, it kind of irks me. I feel like maybe looking at something like, and now I have Contagion stuck in my head again. But now looking at something like Contagion and the idea of like sociological storytelling, a narrative that develops because of trying to describe some sort of bigger things about the world rather than focus on necessarily one specific character. All those characters are focused on one grander issue. That idea of sociological storytelling is very compelling in my opinion, and is maybe even what I would call like postmodern. It no longer is focused on character as the driving factor, but rather purpose as a driving factor. What do I want to convey as a bigger issue that we should really be looking at? I think that's why people nowadays are very drawn to nonfiction, is because it helps us to see the world through a different lens without it turning into a postmodern sort of deconstruction of storytelling. Opening is really good for me, and it's one of the biggest things that I dislike in the movie in comparison is that you lose Chief's point of view quite a bit. Absolutely. I think that that's a great example. And I know that you've loved One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and from a sociological perspective, I feel very torn about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And I think it was a good movie, but it definitely focused entirely on our main character and not. And that's what Hollywood storytelling usually is. That's what makes it easier for people to follow along, right? That's the reason why Contagion did poorly in the box office, was because it was hard to follow along with. Because we were telling about bigger concepts, and those bigger concepts were told through multiple characters who all had different perspectives. Yeah, I think that in reality, it's easy to get lost in the examination of how structures for stories should work. And then that creates even more opportunity for you to be like, well, what kind of narrative do I want to tell in all of this? And I think that you get there by practicing the writing of narrative, right? It's really two separate skills when it comes to filmmaking and film criticism. And some people are very drawn to film criticism and not at all drawn to filmmaking. Some people are really, really drawn to literary criticism and not at all drawn to creative writing. And I think that's entirely fair to be drawn to one versus the other. But I do think that people who are drawn to the criticism of literature oftentimes will create literature that's focused more on criticism than it is on creation. And so that's where you get, on a filmmaking perspective, people like Quentin Tarantino that are making movies about making movies more than they are about the movie themselves. Which is totally a fine thing to do. He's a very well-respected filmmaker for whatever reason. And I think that ultimately there are many different ways to approach it. I would not want anything that I'm saying to come off as prescriptive other than for those who don't know what to do for their first step. All right. I love Steven Universe so much, and how pretty much the entire plot of the last couple seasons and the whole show are internal struggles, right? Well, and they're internal struggles that we see played out through specific characters, right? But what it's focused on is illustrating those specific characters' internal struggles more than it is to focus on I don't want to call it plot, but like focus on, maybe plot, like an overarching narrative thing that's going on. I would have to watch the last season, but I noticed that from the get-go. And that was mostly like, what are you willing to focus on? Did I drop out? It's getting all shaky over here, even though it says it's excellent quality. Yes. Yeah. Rather than defeating a villain or obtaining a goal. Well, and I think of something like Avatar. Avatar is a great example of like very sociological storytelling that's still focused on one overarching narrative, where the narrative never gets in the way of ultimately showing us who the characters are. It never gets in the way of letting us take little side trips and showing us what the world is. It takes its time and it cares about who it's writing about. It doesn't just kind of throw us to the wolves. And I think that is ultimately something that should be focused on is whether or not you're caring about your characters and whether or not you're caring about the situations that they're in, rather than simply marking it off as a plot point, right? Like, which again, I'm torn about. Now I'm in like some sort of weird place of self-criticism where I'm like, or maybe not. Like, you could do it the other way too, but I just don't know if that's the best way for where you guys are at. For the vast majority of you, the best way to get to that place is to start with these sensory details, because sensory details are very easy to also draw from your environment. And at least it gets you started writing. And on top of that, you can say, the reason this sentence sucks is because Mr. Jackson told me this is how I was supposed to write. And then you can fix the sentence later and not feel so bad about it. With that being said, I'm going to go. That's been my hour. I got to go pick up the pup. So you guys are all lovely and amazing. I hope you had fun talking about this sort of stuff. I will give you more information as I get it about how the school year is going to work. This is not goodbye. We're going to have some fun time talking about all this stuff later. I promise you. And we will see each other again. All right? Snap your crap. Pap your schmap. Everybody yell quack. Quack.